Did anybody ever have a nickname? Now, I don't know if you've had one. I mean, for me, my really nickname was kind of boring. Folks used to call me Scotty. And the reason they called me Scotty was because I was younger and shorter than the other Scott in our youth group. So he got to be Scott and I became Scotty. And actually, that name pretty much stuck with me. But that's kind of a boring nickname. And most of the nicknames that we had for our friends were kind of boring too. Like we had Big Phil and we had Little Joe. Well, Big Phil was called Big Phil because he was really tall and big, and Little Joe, we called him Little Joe because he was the shortest of our group. So, again, those are kind of boring, but there are some great nicknames out there, and some of you may have had some really good nicknames. Now, a nickname is often given to us to describe something about who we are, or sometimes they're even something about who we're complete opposite to. But oftentimes they try to describe some kind of characteristic for who we are. And it's really almost as if we become known through that nickname as it describes something of our personality, our body type, our outlook on life, or something like that. So nicknames are really interesting. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the other day I was noticing that God had nicknames. And maybe you didn't know this, but God in the Old Testament is referred to as Yahweh. And there's a lot of talk about why God is called Yahweh, and not something to get into this for this particular devotional. But there were all kinds of different names for God, and some people felt like even the name of God could not be spoken because it was just that sacred. But oftentimes, the way in which folks referred to as God or referred to God was what God had done for them because it helped put who this God was in context. And in the prophecy of Jeremiah, during the time of Jeremiah, there's this interesting passage where it talks about the changing of the way the people will refer to God. It comes in Jeremiah chapter 23. And here Jeremiah gives this prophecy about how the days are surely coming when God will raise up from David this righteous branch. Okay, so it's like a prediction about the coming of the Messiah. But then he goes on to say this, Jeremiah 23, verse 7. He says, "Therefore, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought us out of who brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives who brought us out and led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the land of the north and out of all the lands where he had driven them." Okay, now that's a pretty long nickname, right? But basically what he's saying is, there was a time when you knew God as the one who brought you out of Egypt. But now, Jeremiah says, to the people who are living in exile, the days are surely coming when you are going to call him the God who let us out of our exile in the north and the places where God had driven us. Do you see what's going on here? There's a change in the way in which people are experiencing and knowing God. Back in the olden days, Jeremiah says, we used to just talk about how God rescued us from Egypt. Now we're going to be talking about the God who rescued us from exile. And that got me to wondering, how are we going to refer to God? I mean, do we continue to refer to God as the one who once, a long time ago, rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt? Are we going to refer to God as the God who once led the people out of exile? Or is there something more fresh in our minds that we can give God as the nickname, the one that describes what God has done for us now, today? As I was thinking about this, I wrote down some possible names. What if this is the Lord who saw us through the pandemic? Or the Lord who made God's self visible to me in worship? The Lord who remembers my sin no more? Maybe this is the Lord who led us through recovery. Maybe it was the Lord who healed me after my divorce. Or maybe it was the Lord that time and time again was with me in all things. You see, Jeremiah is talking to the people in exile, and he's saying, realize that this God that you worship is not just the God who did amazing things in the past, but this is the God who's doing amazing things for you now, the one who's going to lead you out of exile. Now is our turn to name who this God is. Who is God to you? How do you know God? How do you experience God? What is the nickname for how God has brought you into a new place? Take some time this week. Consider how God is right now with you, working in you. And what will you name that God?